Coach Robb podcast, answering questions and eliminating frustrations about health, wellness, and performance since 1987.
Welcome to the Coach Robb Performance Podcast number 2. I'm your co-host, Toolman Dan. Coach Robb, what's happening?
Hey, good morning, brother. Thank you so much for carving out some time for our listeners. I'm really excited about this subject.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about offsetting the aging process associated with health and performance. And this is going to be a cool podcast. We're going to break it down into basically, segments of 10 years. And we're going to start in the teenage years and walk through, all the way until you're a senior citizen. And I like this one because there's so much, it's so different as you walk through the stages of life, right? Like everybody told me, I'm going to be 40 this year. But everybody said, man, when you hit 30, body's gonna change. Oh man, when you hit 40, your body's gonna change. And when you're young, you're like, nah, it's not. That's BS, right? Well,
Absolutely.
It does, Rob. It does.
Yep, you're exactly right. And just to set the context for all the listeners, what we're going to do is we're going to take health and wellness as well as performance, because obviously performance is based off of a foundation of health and wellness. But we're going to look at it in 10-year increments. And we're going to go from literally the teenage years all the way up to 70 plus. I'm very fortunate to say that I've got quite a few athletes that are 70 and above, and they're doing endurance events, riding moto, wakeboarding. I mean, they're doing a bunch of stuff. And we'll talk about each stage in both the challenges, but more importantly, like we want to do in each one of our shows, is make sure we can provide a solution. We don't want to just focus on the negative, but we do want to set the context for people who are in the current stage. Now, when we get into the 20s and 30s, we have, like yourself, you've got little ones at home. So they're going to be kind of coming into that teenager stage. And then unfortunately, we're all getting older, right? So as we get through that 30 stage, we're starting to address the issues at 40. And so I want to encourage everybody, grab a piece of paper, no matter how old you are, please pay attention to the challenges associated with each stage. And if you can embrace the solution on each one before and after you're going to be on the fact of really enjoying a life of health, wellness, and ultimately performance. And I don't want that to sound like a textbook cliche. So I'm really looking forward to this one as well. There's a lot of meat on the bone associated with this subject. I'm looking forward to it.
There is. Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about the teenagers. The teenagers, their biggest thing is time management. And, from an athletic standpoint, you're young, you're just full of energy. You tend to just work out with not a lot of purpose, right? Maybe not a lot of warming up, cooling down. Talk a little bit more with us about the teenagers and their segment, I guess you would say.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, when we're a teenager, we feel like we've got nothing to lose. Time is our friend. The one thing that I want to bring to everybody's attention, if you have a teenager or if you're in that teenager stage, is we need to learn very early on that we can't manage time. We can only manage ourselves. So when we get into the future decades and we move from just trying to get through school, we look at trying to accelerate our career education levels, athletic capabilities, and success. It all hinges on this foundation of time management. And when we look at the typical teenager, and without getting onto a political soapbox, I'm very much against social media. I'm very against the Xbox and all, not because of what it is, but because of the way it devours so much valuable time. I think it's pretty fascinating, and I do this quite a bit with my young athletes. You have the ability on your phone to go and look at where you've spent your time on your phone. Now, if you're somebody who runs your business and you're checking your emails and you're doing stuff like that, cool, I understand that. But it is astounding when you look at how much time is spent looking at videos on the various social media platforms. And if you've done any kind of research, you realize that they've literally written these apps to grab your attention and not let you get away from it. Short attention span, the next thing's coming up quickly. And if you didn't think it was working, why are so many of the platforms emulating one another? Because they know it works. Well, let's come back to where we're at on this subject today, and that is at the teenage at that stage of being a teenager, learning how to manage time becomes the most important. I know for myself, Dan, when I was in college, I was very meticulous on, all right, if I know the project is due on the 15th, I made sure it was done by the first of that month. Why? Because I don't like that angst. And we've talked about it and we'll continue to talk about this. The human brain works better when it's not under the pressure of a deadline. We refer to it as working proactively versus reactively. But to set the context of this first age group that we're looking at, it's absolutely imperative that we all start to learn how to block out an hour a day, a week, a month, a quarter, because unfortunately we're sitting here. What'd you do yesterday? You can't get it back. The most valuable thing is time, right? So when we wake up tomorrow morning and we look back at yesterday, what are we full of? Frustrations and regrets. Those can be eradicated. That's why I want to make sure that we don't just complain about it. Well, how do we provide a solution? You've got to manage every single minute of every day. Now, did I say that's enjoyable? No. My wife, Michaela, she's as right brain as they come. And it's hard for her, but she's done a great job starting to embrace the idea that we've got to manage time. So I want, as we get this started, Dan, everybody, regardless of your age, stop to think about what time are you going to bed? Because you already know what time you're going to wake up tomorrow. So is that giving you at least 8, preferably 9 hours of sleep? Block out when you're going to go to work and or school. Include driving to and from. When are you going to purchase and actually sit down and consume? You got to purchase, prep, and consume your food. If you don't put it on your schedule, guess what? It's not going to happen. And especially for someone like yourself, Dan, that's extremely busy and you're very focused. How many times do we start a day at work? We look down and go, gosh, 4 hours has gotten by. And you maybe you ate breakfast at 7, but now it's noon and you haven't put anything in your mouth.
Yeah, that happens very frequently, very frequently.
Absolutely. But at a teenager level, I don't have a problem if it's somebody who's balancing 8 to 9 hours of sleep. They're in school for 6 to 7 hours. They're doing their homework. They're trying to focus on their eating, and then they're trying to squeeze in some sports performance training and or competition. The frustration as a teenager is they're always on a rush. You ever notice as I always say, they're going to be late to their funeral? I mean, it's the idea that, come on, guys, you knew we were leaving the house at 5 o'clock. Why are you starting to pack your bags up at 4:45? That should have been done the night before. You see how we just want to reverse engineer it. But as we said at the beginning of this podcast together, when you start getting into the future decades, still none of us are immune to the management of time because we can't, management of ourselves because we can't control time. So I hope that makes sense as we get this conversation started.
It does. And I think once we get into the later, the 20s or the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, right? As you're in your 50s, I'm in my 40s or going to be in my 40s. Typically people in our age groups have teenagers, right? So it's going to be important for us to lead by example for our teenagers and set them on the right path, right? And so that means we have to be on the right path at our age as well. So I think that it's going to be, and you said something, Rob, that the social media and I'm guilty. I think we are all guilty to some aspect, but I think to be, it should be something that you should be conscious of and try to. I didn't know you can go on your phone and set limits on your social media. Maybe that's a good idea for some people. I've thought about that for myself. So you could waste a lot of time, definitely.
Yeah, and when we move into the next stage, right? If we can't, let me digress for just a moment. I'm not saying that, like, especially for the younger children, their currency is that phone. If you want to watch a young child freak out, take their phone away for a week. I mean, they literally lose their minds. When you and I went to the beach, we lived perfectly fine when we would call our best friends and their mom or dad would answer the phone and say, Dan's at the beach today. Your mom may leave you a note, hey, Rob called, cool. But you lived, I lived, hey, I called, Dan's not home, he's at the beach. But nowadays, everyone's at the beach on their phone looking at what everybody else is doing at home. Then why are you at the beach? And we're going to talk about this being in the moment here a little bit later, but I want to come back to social media. I use it for research. I do spend time on it, but here's the difference. And this is what I encourage all my young athletes. There's nothing wrong with enjoying, because for the young athletes and the youngsters that are listening, we understand that that may be their downtime. That's cool, but you have to have a start and a stop time. Like you said, Dan, putting a limit on it is one thing. Putting it in your schedule. So like, for example, when I go to YouTube to do research, I'm going to YouTube at a specified time. If you guys, and I'll show in 100% transparency, go and look at my post on Instagram. Do you notice the consistency in the time? It's because I get a pop-up on my time management. I use Microsoft Outlook. I get a pop-up that says post on social media. Okay. So every single minute of every single day, literally, I have on my calendar when to go to bed, when to wake up. I literally have on there, take the trash to the street. And I put it at the same time every Tuesday and Thursday. Why? Because I don't want the trash to back up, and B, I don't want to worry about it. When it comes up on my screen, I go do it. And when we're looking at this bigger picture, I'm not saying don't use social media because I sound like a hypocrite. I post on social media every day, right? Well, if you go to my Instagram account, Coach Robb Beams, I'm just trying to answer a question every day. If you go to YouTube, I'm answering a question every day. So there's a purpose and a reason why I use it. And for me, it's to educate people to eliminate frustrations. My point is it's done at the exact same time every single day. You'll notice my Instagram Shorts post at 5:30 every afternoon. My Instagram posts in the morning and my YouTube updates, they post every day at 10:15 in the morning. It's on the calendar. Now, I know if you're right brain, you're like, no, I'm not living that kind of structure. I get it, but you can't manage time. You can only manage yourself. So for the youngsters, I say carve out a half hour once you've slept 8 hours. You've not only gone to school, but also did your homework, very important. And you've helped with the chores around the house. And you've made sure that you've eaten consistently. Well, now let's talk about, did you have enough time to do your workout? If you did, and you still have 30 minutes left, absolutely do social media. Now, like you said, Dan, this subject that we're talking about on the teenage years, it's going to infiltrate for the rest of the decades that we're going to talk about.
Yeah,
very
it
important.
is. And when you're young, you want to be cognitive of appreciating the opportunity to learn and grow and achieve the personal goals and the athletic goals that you seek in the future. Anything else, Rob, on teenage years before we move on to the 20s? Because I think the 20s is scary, dangerous. There's a lot going on in this decade. But are we good on the teenage years?
Yeah, we're good on the teenage years. I think you hit on something that's very important, and I hope people will pause and think about this. Why have we lost the desire to learn as a teenager? And I don't want to get on a political soapbox here, but what I'm amazed with is I listen and I don't read the news, and again, transparency. I don't read the news. I don't watch the news. I don't read the paper. I stay away from that kind of stuff. But what I'm amazed about when I do hear a story that a young person is robbing a bank, mugging people, doing stuff that they do, what are we doing? When you think about, if you guys go back and rewind this podcast, you carve out 8 to 9 hours of sleep. You're at school or work for 8 to 9 hours. Let's just call that 16 hours. You take time to go to and from the store. You sit down, you eat. Let's say that fills up another 2 to 3 hours. Now you're at 17, 18 hours. There's only 24 in a day. We want to train. We want to race. Where do people have time to go and hurt and be mean to other people? What you guys know, if you followed me for any period of time, I've been trying to teach myself the guitar now for a decade. So if I have an extra 15 minutes, I'm on my YouTube channel trying to figure out how to learn a chord and transition. I'm just trying to constantly grow my brain intellectually. I'm always trying to learn in the athletic world, trying to be a better dad, trying to be a better husband, right? Where do we have time to be mean to other people? To your point though, Dan, the desire to learn, the desire to grow, probably the most enjoyable things of my career, especially in the last 10 years, is traveling abroad. I've never experienced so much cultural diversity. And boy, you talking about creating a paradigm shift in my head. They simply do things different than we do. And it was wonderful. It was a great experience. And I've come back with a completely different respect. And think about, Dan, you have a very young family, right? and you go and you take your daughter and she gets a chance to get exposed to things because you took the time to travel. And then when you take the time over a meal and you're talking about those cultural experiences, we're growing, we're becoming culturally aware, not politically. This whole supposedly we don't respect other cultures type thing, I think that has gotten taken out of context and used in the wrong. But again, I don't want to go down that bunny trail. I love watching our young children learn. I remember when my boys were young, believe it or not, what they were fascinated with is when you would close a trunk, they would get down on their knees and they were trying to figure out where that mechanism would actually, they hear it go
How it
click
latched.
and how it latched, right? And I always used to say, it's amazing how the world is their oyster. And I always tease Michaela, when do we lose that wonderment of learning? And I'm glad you brought that up, because we're going to grow by eating new foods and hearing different types of music. And when and where do we lose that? Oh, that's right, because people aren't communicating with one another. They're sitting there with their face buried in the phone. Michaela and I had the privilege to go to Australia. And what we like to do is when we land, we put on our running shoes and we go run to start to learn the city, right? And we run by the Sydney Opera House there, where you've got the big white, beautiful, that big symbolic with the Sydney Harbor Bridge. And we were blown away by how many people were sitting on their phone at the base of the Sydney Harbor Bridge. Like, why did you even bother to come here?
Yeah.
The
That's what I'm
world
saying.
is out in front of you, not here.
A lot of this stuff bleeds off into the later decades in life, and we're going to talk a lot about that. Like you
Yep.
said, take note of the before and the after decades, and to prepare. But all this goes with influence and respect and managing time and everything, and we've lost that in a lot of ways. So, and we have an opportunity to regroup and reset ourselves, and we're going to talk about that throughout today's podcast as well. It's never too late to change. So
No.
let's get into the 20s. The 20s, like I said, is an interesting time, and it was an interesting time in my life. I'm sure it was in your life.
Yes, sir.
It's you create a lot of personal and athletic maturity in this decade of life, and this is one that you can really steer off course real fast. You're 21 years old, you're out at the bars, you're hanging out, you're in these totally different social groups. Some people get wrapped up in drugs. You can go down the slippery slope in your 20s.
Yeah, and I'm going to start this decade off in a very tumultuous example, and I'm going to apologize to our listeners up front. One of the things that amazes me is I have a couple of friends who have some mentally disabled children, and I love spending time with them because they still, maybe because there's a lack of development in their brain, they're still mesmerized by simple things, and they might be 17, 18 years old, but they've got the mental capacity of a 3-year-old, And what I always say to Michaela is, what's sad to me is I watch these children that are maybe physically unable to run across the field. I look at these people, these young children, and even adults for that matter, that are stuck in a body or a brain where a disease has robbed them of their health. What those children would give to be able to run across the field, and then here you and I are with perfectly healthy bodies, and we're doing everything we can to screw it up. And then we chalk it up to we're having fun. And then we chalk it up to, well, you got to live life a little bit. And then I just stop and I look at a child that can't run across the field because of a physical ailment or a mental disability. And that's really hard on me, hard for me to digest. I've shared on the podcast previously, my family has been negatively affected by drugs and alcohol my entire life. So I'm not a big fan of it. I can look you in the eyes and tell you I've never tried an illegal drug, mainly because I've seen what it's done. And I've watched my dad discipline my brothers and sisters, and I wanted no part of that. So I'm not a goody, but I had an incredible reverence and a respectful fear from my dad. I was never willing to try that. But then when I get around disabled children and disabled adults who would give anything for you and I to have the mobility that we have, and to think that we spend money and time getting ourselves screwed up and then chalking it up to living life, experiencing life, that's where I guess I have a problem with the 20s, because like you said, you move into the 30s and then you start to recognize the ramifications of those behaviors. We're going to talk about complacency here in a few minutes, but I don't know of anybody, regardless of your age, maybe above the age of 10, that wouldn't recognize that starting smoking or dipping or doing these tobacco-based products or doing an illicit drug, everybody thinks that it's not going to affect them as much as everybody else. But yet we've got so much evidence that it does affect, direct or indirect. If it doesn't directly affect you, it might affect the people around you. And that's, like you say, where the 20s become very, very interesting, because you just made a comment that I think is profound. And if anyone's taking notes, it's the one to write down. When we start looking at athletic performance, it's very easy for us to go, hey, look, I didn't take strength seriously. I didn't take flexibility seriously. I didn't take these various components. And now 10 years later, I've got nagging injuries. I've got bursitis. I've got all these inflammatory problems. I've got, pain in my elbows and shoulders because maybe I tried to lift more weight. We weren't looking and working on incremental improvements. We just kind of jumped on these big gaps. We're looking at it athletically, and that's why this is a performance podcast. Well, just like you said, Dan, that's why I think it's the meat on the bone for this decade. When you go and you make a lot of socially poor behavior choices, where does that put you? Well, if you're partying like a rock star all Friday night, where does that leave you for Saturday morning for cross training, high quality training, or even a race?
And here's I want to spin off that, because when you're in your 20s, Rob, very easy to go get hammered Friday night. You're 21 years old. You go get hammered Friday night, and 9 times out of 10, you can make it to CrossFit Saturday morning, or you can make it to the gym. You can make it to the track. You can swim your laps Saturday morning, but you get yourself in this groove, right? That you can keep continuing to do that. And I said at the beginning of the podcast, your body changes, life change. I mean, things change, right? You can't continue to do that in your 30s, in your 40s. Because I don't know about you, Rob. I drink maybe once or twice a year, maybe. And the reason I don't is it takes me a week to recover from a night of drinking, and it's not worth it to me, right? So things change, but this is where you set yourself up, right, for failure early in your 20s if you're not careful.
Well, I like the word that you just said. It isn't worth it. Remember we were talking about earlier, the currency. When you have a child, when you and I were growing up, our parents would you and I have a moto background. Our parents would punish us for bad grades or being disrespectful or talking back. We lost our motorcycles first. If you really screwed up, you lost all phone privileges. And if you really screwed up, you were in your bedroom. You went to school, you came home, you're in your bedroom, and you were in there for a week. It's currency, right? At the time, you didn't have cell phones. We loved riding our motorcycles. So your parents are going to always hit you with where your current currency is at. When you get into the 20s, 30s, and beyond, what's the most valuable currency? Your health. Yeah. See, we started at the 20s, the most valuable currency was time, because it seemed like you had an endless amount of time. Well, now you start to realize the behavior associated with time starts to your point, starts to have ramifications on the health moving forward. You start to realize, hey, wait, maybe I'm 30 pounds overweight. I physically can't even run around the block if I wanted to. Or you try to play with your young children and you're out there on the soccer field and you're winded. And all of a sudden you have that mental aha moment where you're like, oh man, I need to lose some weight. Go back. What was the cause of that? You thought you were invincible. Like you said, you used to be able to do it, keyword. And then when you look at the idea that the body is constantly, now you don't drink as much as I do. Anybody who's followed me for a long period of time knows I love craft beers. Now I do try to limit them to 1, maybe 3 if I know want to be somewhere for 5 or 6 hours. And I always make sure I'm eating, because I don't like the feeling of being inebriated. I don't like that feeling of not being able to snap out of something. So that's me. I'm not judging anybody who drinks more than 2 or 3 beers. Once I start to get the feeling of it, I'm out. I just don't like to lose control. Now, my wife will tell you it's because I'm a control freak, and I'll own that, right? My whole world is set in a square, as Michaela reminds me constantly. I live in a world of zeros and ones. So for me, it's very easy to be absolute. Now, I do have family members who have addiction issues, and I'm by no means making light that I do understand that people have addictive personalities and things like that. But how many times have you and I talked off the record? If I know, and I've talked to my brothers and sisters about this, if I know that I've got an addictive personality, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make myself, this comes back to discipline, which is hard. I'm going to make myself hang around people who make good choices, because if I've got an addictive personality, I want to hang around people who are already successful, because I know that that's going to draw me into becoming the next success. I don't want to be negative, but if you want to be the next thug at school, hang around deadbeat kids at school. If you want to be the next, whatever your sport of choice is, go learn and hang around for people who've been there, done that. You're just going to, I mean, there's nobody listening to this webinar that desires to be a physician that isn't going to start by reading books about how to become a physician. An accountant isn't going to study, they're going to study accounting books. That's what the library is so good about. Ironically, how many kids go in libraries anymore now that we have Google? But again, I'm going to kind of bring up a politically sensitive subject here, but when you look at a lot of the discussion points, they said, well, what's holding people back from an economic development standpoint is a lack of access to knowledge. Well, we have the internet now, but we seem to have a higher level of social issues. You can no longer say it's because of lack of access to knowledge. So that's where I go back and I look at self-discipline. Remember we said, when you're young in the teenage stage and you start to learn to manage time, that's your first active role of self-discipline. Parents need to help the kids understand that by holding them accountable. I need the dishes done by 5 p.m. At 5 p.m., if it's not done, there has to be accountability put to that. Well, as we move into the 20s, right, we need to realize who we hang around with, we're going to emulate. We're either going to be the next positive contribution to society, we're going to elevate our sport of choice to the next. That is our responsibility as an individual as we gravitate towards other successful people. I think it's cool if anybody does mastermind groups. If you've been around a mastermind group, what is it? It's a small group of people that bring their different expertise, and we all share our ideas so that I can learn from you, Dan, you can learn from me. I can grow your business quicker. You can help me grow my business quicker. Well, for that hour and a half that we meet a month, look at the value of that versus us getting together and doing something bad to ourselves physically or doing something harmful. What I mean is drinking and driving. Our choice is now negatively affecting the health and the well-being of other people. So this is where that 20 stage is very, very difficult, because if we go off of that foundation of our choices, you talked about growing as a person, right? We want to mature as an individual. Well, let's jump into the athletic realm. I refer to that as athletic maturity. Every time you train, that's a building block. Every time you race, you learn, you get an opportunity to take your training and put it to the litmus test. Training block over training block, race over race, you become more mature as an athlete. But here's where we want to get a little bit deeper. Every workout increases bone density. Every workout increases tensile strength of the tendons and ligaments. Every workout builds more muscle. Could be raw strength, muscular endurance, lactate tolerance. So now your tendons and ligaments and bones and muscles, they're improving on a linear fashion. That's what we refer to as athletic maturity. If you haven't, you listen to some of these podcasts, you and I, obviously we have a moto background. If you listen to Cooper Webb on Gypsy Tales with Chase, he literally talks about this exact subject. His ability to adapt to a track quickly, learn a track, he says it in his own words, it's just based on experience, which is what we're talking about. Those teenage years, if we really stay focused on growing ourselves culturally, athletically, all the elements, when you get into the 20s and you're gravitating around other successful people with same goals and objectives, and then you do it athletically, look at how you are at the end of your 20s. Unfortunately, there seems to be two ends of the spectrum. There's very few that sit right in the middle.
Yeah. So the 20s, let's wrap up the 20s. The takeaway is you can't manage time, only yourself, and you got to learn to prioritize your personal growth, and that's personally, professionally, financially, and athletically. So, like I said, the 20s is an interesting decade for sure. Anything else that you want to hit on the 20s before we move to the 30s?
Well, the
30s.
on the latter part of the 20s is just remember that's usually when we tend to start bringing little ones into the world, and our habits are going to be emulated by the next generation behind us. And that sometimes could be a pretty frightening thought if you're not doing things in the right way, because you realize, and this is a bone of contention that I have with Michaela all the time. If you grew up in a family that's very violent and vocal and alcoholics, you see the outcome of that. You would think that the person would go the other direction, but for some reason, a human being a lot of the times just emulates what they've already seen modeled, which is a pretty frightening thought.
Yeah. Let's move into 30s. This is where I'm at. I'm at the tail end, Rob. I'm at the tail end of my 30s, but I can relate here. 30s is important to learn how to avoid complacency, right? We know we should do it, but we just don't. And there's so many different reasons why. I'll just share my personal experience. I've got a lot going on in life in my 30s. I have a 7-year-old now, and so I had her in my 30s. So you got stress of a child. I had 2 businesses. I've got a normal regular job now, along with my business. I still try to get as much writing in as possible. I'm trying to grow my financial wealth. I mean, the 30s is the key time to start, growing financial wealth. And I'm stressed, Rob. And you get into a point where you just don't want to do stuff. Like, I'm sure you do want to do it. Like, I want to work out every day, but I find myself where it's easy to get complacent in your 30s. Go ahead and tell me I'm right, because I think I'm right.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And ironically, this is the pivotal decade. Most people think, well, halfway to 100 is 50. Wouldn't that be the pivot point? No, 30 is. And it's because of the word that you used a couple times in your explanation on your own experience, and that's stress. Because unfortunately, if we've made bad choices when we were younger, maybe we didn't finish an education, or maybe we made some bad choices and put ourselves into a huge financial hole. Stress is killing us, right? You're there, as a country song says, there's too much month at the end of the money. And you're sitting there just working your butt off, just trying to keep your head above water. Look at those 4 quadrants that you referenced earlier: personal, professional, financial, and athletic. Today, we're talking about the athletic realm, but we can never underestimate the stress that comes from the other 3. Now, yourself, and I appreciate you sharing with our listeners, when your daughter came along, you now realize you're financially responsible, you're morally responsible for her safety, keeping her warm, keeping her clean, keeping her safe. So now your stress level is not just you. And now let's go back to what we were teasing about. You make bad social decisions, you make bad eating habits, you have bad sleeping habits, and now you already are a fatigued individual that now has to be concerned about your wife. And not only you and your wife, but now your wife and your child, or children if you have more than one. So now we look at this 10-year phase where we all had that idealistic thought of, I want to start a family, I want to expand my business, like you said, I want to grow my financial wealth. Well, now you realize it's not just you making a decision for yourself. Your decisions affect positively or negatively those around you. So you feel like somebody's putting their foot on your throat. And I hate to, again, use a negative example, but I think it will help create clarification. If you squandered those 8 or 9 years and you didn't go to school, I'm not judging that you didn't go to school. Please stick with me. What I'm saying is, that you could have been an architect. That you could have been whatever. This is where we get into those words could, would, and should. I'm not putting those words in your head. You are. But the word regret is what we alluded to earlier. And this is where the regret gets really, really heavy, because you realize you just lost 20 years of your life where you could have finished your degree and just moved into that. But maybe you were the person that said, screw the system, I'm going to do it my way. For some people, it works out really well. Maybe you were somebody where you got thrown a curveball. Maybe your parents got killed in a car accident and you were forced to raise your brothers and sisters. That's no fault of your own, but that's why it's up here. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. I could have done this, I would have done that, but my parents got killed in a car accident. I had to step up. It doesn't mean that it's only our bad behaviors and choices that put us in a stressful situation. Life has its own stresses. So unfortunately, I have to use a negative example to get people to understand the positive. Let's say that you did everything by the book. You still have stress, as you said, Dan, because you started a couple businesses on your own. You've gone into a full-time environment, still working your businesses because they're still passion projects for you. You take your health very seriously. You like to ride motorcycles. You take your wife very seriously. You do date night regularly. You take time to take your daughter to the playground. That doesn't just happen. What does it do? Do you see how it comes back full circle? I should be able to call you up and say, hey, Dan, what time are you taking your daughter to the playground? Hey, man, 3:30, we're out the door. Because your daughter isn't going to get to the playground unless you schedule it. And if it's not scheduled, you're going to find something else to do with it. Why? Because you're this adulthood thing that we all rushed into that we thought was really cool. We all wanted to grow up, right? We've definitely got oversold on this concept. And now here we sit. We got our daughter that's a little bit antsy because she hasn't seen the outdoors yet. So she's just a pent up bundle of energy. Your wife hasn't been on date night in a month. You guys are like two ships passing in the dark. So just stop right there. You're running yourself ragged with work, obviously, because you don't have time to go to the playground or date night. You have two people that are pent up energy, wondering why you're not taking time for them. At the same time, the bills are piling up, and yet you're like, but I want to go ride my motorcycle. I want to stay fit. That's what makes this stage so difficult, because we all couldn't wait to get here. And then as it stacks on, now we're hitting a high level of exhaustion. That's personally. Remember, we said there's 4 quadrants. Let's jump in that 4th one, athletically. This is where the risk of injury goes up exponentially. Nobody should be doing a sport-specific activity when you're tired, dehydrated, hungry. Well, when do we squeeze in a lot of our cross training? When the kids go to bed, right? Or we're going to get up early in the morning before the kids wake up. Well, now you've cut into sleep. So now you're tired. You're not eating enough because you're too busy to eat. Or if you are eating, it's usually when you're doing 3 other tasks. So that's eating from point A to point B. What did we say in a previous show? 99% of the people hit a drive-through because they're short on time. Yep. You go, no, Rob, I'm hungry. No, back up the train. If you had made the time, keyword, if you had made the time to go to the grocery store and you made the time to cook and pack your food to put it in your cooler that's on the front seat of your car, and yes, you're busy going from point A to point B, from work to the soccer field, you would have at least had something to grab onto that's wholesome, good, natural food that you cooked, or maybe it was left over from dinner last night because you made the time to cook dinner, you made the time to sit down with your family and actually have an adult conversation, which the kids don't have communication skills anymore, right? Now, because you don't have a cooler, you're running through the drive-through, not because you have what's the word I'm looking for here? You're going to beat yourself up and say you're not disciplined, so you hit the drive-through again. No. It's because you didn't have a cooler full, and the cooler's not full because you didn't make the time to cook it, and you couldn't cook it because you didn't have the time to go buy the food. We bring this full circle because now the athlete goes out, they end up getting hurt. Now, you tell me the key word you said earlier, stress. You still have all of those stresses in your personal, professional, and financial realm, and now you're injured over here in the athletic realm. You wonder why we start to lose our marbles and we start to become impatient? And what does stress do to us, Dan? It makes us fat.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Well, now we're looking in the mirror with dad bod, and now we're like really pissed.
And this is the decade where you start putting on body fat. It's, when they say your body's going to change when you hit 30 and in your 30s, it Absolutely. Is true. And that is if you work out every day. That is if you don't work out, your body's going to change no matter what, right? Maybe if you're working out every day, it's probably not going to change as much. But and then this is where people, they gain weight, and then I'm guilty of it. I'm calling myself out. You start gaining the weight, and then you start getting depressed, and then you get more complacent, and it's hard to turn it around. But you just got to find it within yourself to do it.
Well, and this is where I want to come back. And I would encourage anybody who didn't listen to our last podcast, number 60, where we started talking about adrenal fatigue. And and again, I appreciate all the listeners' patience, because I hope you're seeing the methodology that I like to try to illustrate concepts is constantly recycling back on the initial thought. we're at a stage right now where we should be in the prime of our lives, right? We're 30 years old, we've gotten through our education, or we've established a necessary skill set, we've built a network of friends and family, we've got a good business network. We should be in the prime. We should be really producing a lot. You mentioned the word stress. If you go back and you listen to podcast number 60, remember we said, what are the 4 external signs of adrenal fatigue? Now, before we go through the 4 signs, what is adrenal? What do the adrenals do? They're that part of that fight or flight. So when you are going into the office and you have a rogue boss, that's fight or flight for your body. When you're sitting in bumper to bumper traffic and somebody almost cuts you off and you have to lock the wheels up, that's fight or flight. But go another direction. When you eat garbage food and it's high in processed ingredients and it creates a lot of inflammation, your body perceives that as fight or flight. Inadequate sleep, fight or flight. Inadequate hydration, fight or flight. And then, Dan, you just said the big word. Oh, shoot, I've got dad bod in the mirror. So we go to train and we don't train at a moderate intensity because we're in desperation. What do? We smash ourselves. So now exercise becomes fight or flight. Now your adrenal system is the only thing that can help you handle stress. You see how now exercise crosses that threshold because you saw dad bod, and you have dad bod because you're not sleeping. And because you're not sleeping, you're not releasing the hormone that makes you naturally lean, human growth hormone. We have to continue to reverse engineer all the way back to being a teenager. Learn to manage manage yourself. If you learn to manage yourself and you make yourself get yourself 8 to 9 hours of sleep, your body's naturally going to release the hormone. You're already going to be a step closer to being leaner. But because we don't get to sleep, we pack on body fat. Because we don't have time to go to the grocery store, we eat more fast food. We eat more processed foods out of a bag, a box, or some form of a wrapper. So that's why I really enjoy this subject matter, because we're at supposedly the prime of our lives, right? We're in the roaring 30s here. Everything's smoking, everything's going good. But the stress is starting to pack up. The body starts to look a little frumpy. And then we jump into, all right, I'm going to be committed Monday morning. So we starve ourselves, not enough calories. Stress level goes up. We go to the gym and smash myself. Stress level goes up. I'm going to go to the gym every day. Stress level goes up. Now, you didn't have time for your wife to go to date night. You didn't have time to take your daughter to the playground, but now they both see you making time to go to the gym. So now they're pissed off at you. Your stress went up another notch. Now we take it full circle. What is adrenal fatigue, right? You're sitting there, you're firing on all 8 cylinders. The external signs of adrenal fatigue are night sweats, craving simple sugars, low sex drive, and exhausted and you can't sleep. Now, who in their 30s isn't experiencing that? So now you got the body that's giving you these little indicators saying, yo, I've got night sweats. Now, again, mainstream media is going to say, oh, it's because maybe you're hitting menopause. You craving for simple sugar, so you have a sweet tooth, or you can't sleep at night. That's because you've got a busy brain and you can't turn it off. You don't have a sex drive because you're not 20 anymore. See, the mainstream will give you all kinds of excuses. And that's why I appreciate everybody listening to this podcast. You are responsible for all of the situations that you're in, going back to your teenage years, managing your time, behaviors associated with how you use the time, and then it just starts to snowball from there. Because we all want to be fit, we all want to be healthy, we all want to be fast, but unfortunately, we can't turn back the clock. So understand, that's why we said at the beginning of this podcast, you're going to be able to look at each decade, either you're in it, you were in it, or you're going to it, and you can learn something from all 3 stages. So like you said, Dan, 30 is hard because that's where dad bod bites us in the behind.
Yes, it does. But I just want to recap the 30 decade, get back to fundamentals, right? The basic fundamentals of life, make time for sleep, eat right, get your work done, make time for family, because that is the most important, because your family, that should be number one. And get exercise and enjoy the things that you like doing. If you like riding dirt bikes, get to the track. If you like swimming laps, get to the pool. If you like running, get to the trail, so
Let's see, where you're at there, Dan, is we're back to our currency. We say that we love our wives, our partners. We say we love our children. We say that we love to be fit. Well, it isn't going to happen. As I always say, success will never be accidental. Success has to be planned. That's why my program is called the Blueprint of Success. Our mental development program is called the Mental Blueprint of Success. You and I see a house that we love. We don't go try to figure out how to build it. We hire an architect. The architect's probably already got the blueprints because they've sold it 100 times. You've got the blueprints, you get a builder. You're the builder. You build the architectural plans. You're responsible for building the architecture and then adjusting your behavior to make it happen. And that's where, just to clarify, the reason why we call it complacency, the complacency stage, is because at this point, you can't say you didn't know the value of sleep. You didn't know the value of food. You didn't know the value of time. You're in your 30s. You can't plead ignorance anymore. We can deflect and we can come up with excuses. Now, again, if your parents got killed in a car accident, that is not an excuse. That's not what I'm insinuating. But when you sit in front of a television for 8 or 9 hours playing Xbox, eating a bag of chips, you can't seriously look me in the eyes and say you didn't realize that was going to make you obese. You can't take that. You can't make that claim, regardless of your education level. You can't make that declaration. I mean, how many people? This is interesting, Dan. When we were in Australia on their cigarette packs, they actually have a picture of black lung. They actually show pictures of babies that were born, unfortunately, no longer alive because of the cigarette in the baby. They put it on the box, and people still keep buying and smoking the cigarettes. They will open the box that has a picture of a black lung and light it up and smoke it. And we are supposed to be the smartest species on the face of the earth.
Unreal.
Now, please understand, if you're smoking and you're trying to get off of it, I respect that. My mom spent her entire adult life trying to get off of cigarettes. I don't have an addictive behavior or personality, and I saw my mom struggle. I'm not making light of it. I'm saying, if you're a teenager and you've had somebody in your family that's been through cancer, or you've done any research, why would you start smoking today? But today, unfortunately, somebody will try drugs for the first time and think it won't get them. Cigarettes, the whole 9 yards, man.
Yeah.
We're looking at the roaring 30s going into 40. We cannot deflect responsibility any longer.
All right, let's move into the 40s.
Yes, sir.
I'm almost there. Managing the nagging injuries, and this can mean a lot of different things. I manage nagging injuries every morning when I wake up. I feel like I've been hit by a truck just from years and years of crashing, right? But it could, injuries and body aches and things like that. It could mean a lot of different things, right? It could be you did drugs for 35 years, or probably not that long, but you've done drugs all your life, and you've drank all your life, and you're feeling the effects of that, right? So 40 is really where things start catching up to you.
Well, the difficult part of the 40s is at this point, and if anyone's followed me on social media, you see me post this before. If we don't take the time for our health and wellness, we're going to be forced to make the time for our injuries and or our sickness. And that's unfortunately where the 40s grab us by the throat and get our attention, because you're at a point now where you may be bone on bone because you disintegrated all the cartilage in your joints, because you lifted with bad form or excessively heavy. And ironically, you're in a gym where guys that are 20 years older than you are complaining about their shoulders hurting, and yet you're sitting on the bench doing exactly the thing that destroyed their shoulders. You're lifting an exorbitant amount of weight because some internet guru is saying, oh, it won't happen to you if you do this or do that. I get into this all the time with certain exercises that I can promise you most people don't have the functional flexibility to do the range of motion, but people are saying, you just got to ignore what everyone's saying and you got to do the work. Well, that's like you telling me that I can argue with a piece of wood and then I can take that wood beyond its threshold of what it can hold, either on angle or load. And then when it breaks, I say, well, don't worry about it. It's a figment of your imagination. That's what these so-called internet experts are doing, which is pathetic, because they're destroying particularly young people because people get duped into it. Please stop and think about what you're doing. Unfortunately, when you're at this stage, Dan, you've got to own those poor decisions. Now you've got a shoulder, a knee, a low back, a hip that's been jacked up. And unfortunately, this is the stage that we refer to as replacement surgery. Hate to say it, but now you're there. Because if it's bone on bone, You can't create more cartilage. You can't create more, you can't you know, if the ligament's been completely sheared into two pieces, it doesn't fuse itself back together. It has to be surgically put back together. Unfortunately, if once again, we're back to time, we don't address it, what happens? It just gets worse because the body will compensate. If something's missing or out of alignment in the body, something else in the body has to offset that imbalance. Stop and think about that concept.
Yeah, and again, this is kind of the age group where I talked earlier about, your kids are probably starting to get a little bit older, still got a family, still got a lot of different stresses and things like that. And this, I would think that would be the age group where you probably are more apt to get to the track and ride your dirt bike. You're going mountain biking, you're doing the things that you enjoy to do, right? But you're not taking the time to train for it, and not taking the fitness outside of your sport that you enjoy very serious.
Well, you're exactly right. But add one more dynamic. A lot of times, the reason why people are not working on, and just to make sure people understand what you just mentioned there, if you are going to go ride moto, that requires a foundation of strength and flexibility. You don't have it. And to your point, Dan, that the new level and the additional dynamic is, even if the desire is there, the physical body isn't capable of doing it. Some guys can't even walk across the room anymore because their knees are so bad. Yeah, they can go to the gym and do shoulders and bicep and tricep and core, but they can't do anything with their legs. So now, because of that physical limitation, they can't cross train, which you're bringing you're shedding a lot of light on those 3 decades before that we've already spoken about. You've gone past your teenage years when you should be in your prime. You're getting super strong and great flexibility, good strength to weight ratios. You should now be able to capitalize on it. But because it didn't happen, you may be paying the price for that. And now the desire is there, as we're going to see in this next decade, right? You should be really kind of like in the prime. Now the body isn't backing up the desire. So yeah, 40s is a difficult one for sure.
Before we move on to the 50s, I wanted to talk about how to maybe help when you're in your 40s, right? Again, it's kind of a pivotal point in your life where you could still make these changes in life, you could still make your changes in training, but we're all probably facing some type of injury or soreness. What are some things that people in their 40s can do to maybe help them feel better? Is it like massages, chiropractors? One thing I wanted to ask you specifically was cryotherapy. That's kind of getting big. Can you talk a little bit about some of those different things you can do to help yourself feel better?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And what's interesting in that question is everything that you mentioned: chiropractic, massage therapy, cryotherapy, foam rolling, trigger point, contrast therapy, Epsom salt baths. You can do that at 3 years old, and you can do that to 103 years old. Remember, it's interesting that you bring that up because it cross germinates across all decades. The sooner you start it and make it a habit, and you make the time in your week to make it a reality, you get to kind of cash in on the fringe benefits. The hard part about physiology is what you do today, you may not see the benefits of it for sometimes 3 to 6 months. There's a lot of ideologies and a lot of discussion points on how quickly do you see the benefit of today's workout. How much of that is psychosomatic? How much of that is actually physical? How much of that's neuromuscular? How much of that's actually physical? All of those modalities that you refer to, cryotherapy works incredibly well. Contrast therapy, the use of warm and cold. Massage therapy, scraping, where you literally take these devices, you take some hand lotion and literally scrape on the skin. You break down these adhesions. Every single thing works. Michaela and I tease about this. If you were to come into we have a living room area that we keep all of our recovery tools. We own a Beamer, which is PEMF. We have Normatec boots. We own 3 pairs of them. We have every size and shape of foam rollers. We have scraping devices. I even have my massage table, right? The idea here is there one modality that's better than another? Absolutely not. What you have to stay focused on is what is it you're trying to address? So Dan, you bring up a very, very valuable question for our listeners. If you went out to, and you, let's say you race today, and you wake up tomorrow morning and you're extremely sore, or maybe even the evening after your race, and to do contrast therapy, or to do an Epsom salt bath, you're going to feel better the next day. You're going to shorten that soreness window down. Okay. If somebody has unfortunately had surgery and their foot, or let's say somebody broke their ankle and they've had a cast from the bottom of your kneecap all the way down, well, that's going to, there are certain modalities that are going to be a little bit more productive. Every modality is beneficial, but some are more productive than others. If you're trying to break down scar tissue, if you're trying to increase mobility, if your ankle has been sitting in a cast for 8 weeks, that range of motion, as we know, is going to be limited. So there's things that we would do with a scraper. I would do manual massage. I'd do manual manipulation, get the ankle moving up and down, inward and outward. We would be doing all of that. But it's a very good question. There's not one modality that supersedes the other, because like I use a PEMF, it's called the Beamer pad, BEMER. It's expensive. It's an $8,000 pad, but you lay on it and it literally changes the circulation at a cellular level. So we use it before and after, and there's different settings that we can do, whether it's for a warm up or whether it's like Michaela unfortunately got in a severe we use the Beamer to change the settings for healing and recovery. So yeah, great question. All of it works. It's just a matter of how does it work? That's the key. Good
Thanks
question.
for clearing that up.
No,
All
great
right,
question.
all right, old timer. Let's move into your decade.
Oh,
The 50s. I had to throw some shade there,
absolutely. No, it's fair. I'm 55 years old at the time of this recording, and I have to own it. I still feel like I'm 25. I won't lie, but I like to.
You still look early 40s. So
I appreciate it. I like to convince myself that the age is just a number, and I'm very fortunate. I've not had anything physically that reminds me that I'm 55. Gray hair might be giving it away every day I look in the mirror, but physically, I still swim, bike, and run every day. I like to ride moto as often as I can, and my boys and I, we like to do dirt jumping and stuff. So far, there's nothing that my body has said we can't do. I can still wakeboard, surf. I can do stuff like that. Maybe not as nimble, but I can still get it done. But yes, sir, this is the dreaded 50s because I'm in it. That's why I call it the dreaded 50s. And I struggle with this with my clients because this is the decade of boredom. This is the really hard one because, Dan, you're in it right now. You're in that very stressful stage where, you've got a young daughter that very full of energy and has a lot of inquisitory questions, and you take her to the zoo and you take her to the museums, and you and your wife do a great job, but there's a lot of stress on getting from point A to point B and dressed and fed and slept. Now you hit this 50, right? Two decades later, you're not going to soccer practice. You're not making lunches. You don't have 50 loads of laundry to do. You don't have the minivan. And now you're sitting here going, okay, what happened here? And I'm going to self-confess here. When my boys grew up, our daughter is still at home. She's actually graduating here in a couple of weeks. When my boys grew up and moved out, it was absolutely the hardest thing for me to swallow, because again, you don't know until you go through it, you don't know what to expect. When I said goodbye to my sons as they moved to North Carolina and moved off to Gainesville, my oldest son went into firefighter academy. My oldest son, my younger son is up in Hickory, North Carolina. They're both pursuing careers. They're both in great relationships. Everything's great. Man, did it create a withdrawal for me, because I try to be my kid's dad. I try to be Michaela's husband. Like I say, I still try to plug into her daughter because she's here, but she's in all these AP classes and she does all this stuff with school. The 50s is the age of boredom because I don't have to rush to soccer practice anymore. As we were saying earlier, I have more time on my hand than I've ever had. And it's only going to get worse, right? As you get older, and you're just going to have more time. And this is the stage for our listeners where we start to get these grandiose ideas. Dan, you and I have talked about national championship. Now we want to win the world vets, right? You got your AARP in one hand and you've got your race card in the other. And you're just like, how the heck did I get here all of a sudden? Because wasn't it just yesterday I was, chasing my boys around in the backyard on the jungle gym. And now I'm looking at an AARP and trying to qualify for Mammoth or World Vets, or in our endurance division, I'm trying to get registered for Ironman Lake Placid, or Michaela and I like to travel. So maybe we're looking at Ironman France or Ironman New Zealand or Australia. Now, all of a sudden, everybody that's listening to this, when you're in this decade, what are you doing? You're setting some pretty lofty goals.
Yeah.
Because you're bored. We get past the coulds, the woulds, and the shoulds. And we're now realizing, because remember, we were teasing, Dan, you're in it. We've gone past that pinnacle stage, because that was the 30s. Now, all of a sudden, we're sitting here at our 50s and we're looking, and I can only self-confess to our listeners, when your son reminds you that your next decade is 60 years old, I still remember, for those of you that follow us in the triathlon segment, I remember getting second at St. Anthony's in the 15 to 19 age group. That's the largest triathlon that kicks off the triathlon season every year in St. Petersburg, Florida. That seemed like yesterday in the 15 to 19 age group. And for those that are in the endurance world, right, in the runners world, the triathlon world, gravel bike, cycling, you're in the 20 to 24 age group. Then you're 25, 20. I'm in the 50 to 54 age group. My birthday's next month. I'll be in the 55 to 59 age group. Say what? You talk about feeling old, Dan. My first motorcycle was a 78 RM80 with a metal tank, right? So I start working with young racers in the motorcycle world, and I start seeing them being born the year after I graduated from high school. You tell me, I get punched straight in the face.
Yeah.
So my point in not giving you all these examples is this is the stage that our listeners are looking at it going, man, life travels fast. And you even said it yourself at the beginning, hey, be careful. When you turn 30s, everything speeds up. When you turn 50, man, it's like warp speed.
Yeah.
And I know I sound like a surrogate dad here, right? I sound like your grandfather. Just wait, Dad. When you get here, it's going to get even faster. Your daughter's going to be off to college. She's going to be going into all these new stages of life. And you're like, wait, what happened to the little girl that just wanted to go get ice cream and was pumped to go to the playground? What happened to her?
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's an interesting stage of life. And it's, I ride with, we have a group out here called the Sierra Old Timers, and it's all old guys. It's you got to be 40 plus to ride with them, and to listen to these guys. Most of them are in their 50s and 60s. But to listen to these guys, man, it's a lot of fun, honestly. We're going to go down to World Vets. We're going to go down to the 2-stroke World Championship, and they've set these goals for themselves, and I love it because it keeps their mind young. It gives them something to do. It gives them something to look forward to, where they're not going to just rot away, right? And I think that's the most important thing in this, I would think, in this decade, is to set those lofty goals for yourself. Make sure you keep yourself busy, your mind busy, and do the things that you enjoy to do. Do the things that you haven't done in life, and set a goal to get it done, right?
But watch the paradigm shift. Because if what you just mentioned, you can't get to those things and get those things accomplished. You can't even prepare for them, much less accomplish them, without putting them as a priority. We're back to currency. The currency now is time, which you now have a lot more of. But isn't it ironic that when we start having more time, right? We used to hate waking up to alarm. And now when we don't have to wake up to an alarm, we wake up at the time that we used to wake up, and we're not even waking up to an alarm anymore. So now we're really frustrated because we're like, we dreamed about the day that you didn't have to wake up to an alarm, but yet you're still waking up at the same time. And what I find ironic is we, at this stage, start looking for things to bring the familiar stress back into our life because we miss the stress that we resented and fought tooth and nail for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Think about the paradigm shift with that.
Definitely. Well, you move out of your 50s, you move into your 60s.
Yes, sir.
Body starts breaking down, things start changing. Muscle mass, start losing your muscle. Your capacity of doing workouts declines. You may not be able to do something for as long or as hard or as much weight, right? Start losing your sex drive. I'm not there yet, Rob. You're almost there, buddy.
Well, like
not
I
to
said,
throw any
man,
more shade to you, but
no, it's literally, it's my litmus test. I mean, I make myself go to the gym 3 days a week, and I would encourage anybody all the way back to teenagers. You guys need to be lifting weights for various reasons, but the most important is the bone density will continue to stay nice and strong when you lift. Tendons and ligaments, the tensile strength, they stay strong. Muscles, they stay strong. Now, I don't want to sound like, this is a preaching sermon, but here we are now in our 60s. And what is it that we're doing? We're focusing on sleep. We're focusing on strength training. We're focusing on cardiovascular, right? We've made it a priority. Because we've made it a priority, see how it has shifted from, if you don't make the time, you're going to be forced to take the time. Now age is forcing us to take the time, because unfortunately the body's bones, if they're not subjected to load, become brittle. If we don't get that extra amount of sleep, we don't recover. The aches and pains are a little bit more pronounced, but it's been there all along. We just didn't feel it because, like you said, when you're in your teens, momentum, energy, testosterone, adrenaline, we just plow through all these indicators. And the indicators get a little bit louder each decade until now. At this point, you can only work out 2 days a week because it takes you longer to recover. Nothing wrong with that. We're sitting here in our 60s. When you look at the idea, like you said, you didn't take the time for date night. You didn't take the time to be amorous with your partner. Now you remember it, but you're not really getting that fire in the pants, if you will. You're like, uh-oh. Then it hits you that, remember when it was firing on all 8 cylinders, but you didn't have enough time? Or when you were being amorous, your brain was somewhere else, but you can't get that time back. Again, I hope people have stuck with us this far in the podcast together, because we always want to stay away from the words could, would, and should, as long as we're taking responsibility for the things that we can control. But like an illness, we talked about this on a previous show. Cells make up tissue. Tissue makes up an organ, and an organ makes up a series of systems. We don't want to wait till the system becomes diseased when we could have kept the cell health in the right range of sleep and food and hydration, and just the right balance of stress, physically working out, as well as personally and professionally. Well, now we're sitting here in our 60s, right? And now we're being forced to pay attention to the value of sleep, the value of good food, movement. That's what I find is interesting at this stage. Have you ever gone by, and Michaela reminded me last week that I am now eligible for senior living, which is really encouraging. Seriously though, have you ever gone by a retirement community and see those people out on the golf course walking? Right? Because now they've realized, gosh, if I don't move, I'm going to age and feel even worse. Yeah. So now they're doing that. It's interesting how it takes a huge paradigm shift yet again for another decade.
Yeah. I don't want our older listeners to feel bad. I'm giving shade to Coach Robb because that's really all I got on him. So I respect the hell out of you guys for sticking in with our podcast, and you're obviously here for a reason. And I love that, and I respect that so much. Coach Robb, 60s, nutrition, hydration, and sleep is going to be the most important three keys of success in this decade. And like you said, keep the body moving. It's important. It's just like, anytime you don't move something, right? If you have a broken arm, when you get the cast off, the thing's hard to move, right?
Absolutely.
When you get older, that's kind of what happens. It's tougher to move. Anything before we move into the 70 plus?
No, you hit the nail on the head. It's interesting how it takes a paradigm shift on things that we know we can and should do, but we don't. And then it starts to go into the things that we have to do just to survive. And that, like you said, that's what leads us over here to, the 70s and above. It becomes more of the same. If you don't use it, you lose it. And as much as we joke about that, and I'm not making a mockery, but when you've got somebody who's in their 40s and can't get an erection, that should really shed some light on the idea that the body is exhausted. We're not here to badger you on why you're exhausted. I just want you to understand that the reason why there's not a sex drive, or the reason why there is a lot of adipose tissue, isn't just because you might have bad eating habits. It goes back to that S word that you said earlier, Dan. That's that stress. We don't realize what our internal body is dealing with because we almost become desensitized. And when you get to the 70s here, right, you've lived the routine of getting up and working long hours and trying to balance a family and try to keep everything, all the balls in the air at the same time, if you will. So all the 70s and beyond is more of the same thing, but it's out of necessity, unfortunately.
Yeah, in the 70 plus, you start refusing to acknowledge your age. You start refusing to acknowledge your limitations. The risk for injury, I would think, would increase in this age group because you still think you're a young whippersnapper and you try to do something that you just physically cannot or you're limited to. Um, you have to, you start forgetting things. You're putting post-it notes on the refrigerator. Use it
That's
or
right.
you'll use it or lose it.
That's right.
This is
Yep.
this is this is one of my this is a cool age because we still have riders out here that ride at 75, 80 years old, and
Yeah.
they're still sharp as a tack. They're still out there jumping all the jumps, and it's because they've taken the proper steps in the decades before to set them up for success in their 70s. And that might be the coolest thing, Rob, to see some of these old guys out there just sending it, and they're in great shape, great health, because they followed the process in the younger
Well,
years.
as you and I always talk about, right? Life owes us nothing. Life has some certain principles, spend less than you make, make health and wellness a priority, be kind to one another. These aren't new aha moments for anybody, but I'm with you. One of the things I love about doing triathlons is when you go out, Michaela and I have been fortunate enough to be at Ironman Hawaii a few times. You got to realize there's a 60 to 64 age group. You got to realize there's a 70 to 74 age group. They're out there doing the exact same course that the pros are doing. And to your point, Dan, they're out there riding the same track that you're riding. And there might be a factory rider out there breaking in a bike or doing suspension testing. And there's our elderly group out there. They've done everything they can to stay strong. Sure, we've had setbacks financially, personally. We've had injuries. Certainly, we've all had setbacks. And that's what I want to close up this podcast with is no matter where you're at in this, decade, if this series of decades that we're all either have been in or going to or currently in for that matter, we'll acknowledge we've all had setbacks and we've all made decisions that we all regret, but we can't live in the past. That's why I love doing these podcasts, Dan, because my desire is always to help people understand the concept and then give them solutions. And maybe when they listen to this podcast, they might be in a place where it really helps them set the stage for the next one, maybe clean up the past. That's what it's all about. Our other podcast show, the Coach Robb podcast, that's why we call it the People's Podcast. When we're looking at the performance side of things, that's why I appreciate everyone's patience on the format today. The idea here is we can't talk about performance without the foundation of health. And everything we've spoken about runs through that same filter decade after decade after decade. So I'm hoping that this podcast helped a lot of people. And like you said, I want to thank everybody for sticking with us this far in the show. And thank you for supporting the podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. If you guys are watching on YouTube here, make sure you guys like and subscribe. That definitely helps us out. CoachRobb.com, CompleteRacingSolutions.com. Coach Robb, where else can I find you? On Instagram?
Yeah, you guys can follow us on Instagram, Coach Robb Beams. You have to do the full name there. Big thing is you guys are following us here on YouTube. Like Dan said, please make sure you like and subscribe and do us a favor. Let people know about it. Not because we're, trying to toot our own horns. We just hope that if you find it beneficial, we hope that you can share it with people that are important to you. I was talking to an athlete earlier this week. He's a professional motorcycle racer. He's only 23 years old, and unfortunately, he's been diagnosed with Epstein-Barr virus. And that changes the landscape as trying to be a paid professional when you've got this bloodborne disease. His exact words were, "I wish I'd found you 10 years ago." Now, it makes me feel good, but what disappoints me is I can't reach in his chest and physically replace his adrenal system because the adrenals have to be built up every day by balancing food, sleep, and overall stress. And that's exactly why we do these podcasts. That's exactly why we do every day here on YouTube. We answer a question. Like I always say to Michaela, nobody wants to see my ugly face on YouTube. The reason why I'm doing a video a day is you guys have been kind enough to send in questions. And we just have decided as a company, every single day, 365 days a year, there will be a new video on YouTube every single day addressing a question that you send in to us. If you're new to the podcast, feel free to send us an email at contact@coachrobb.com. In the description box below, we've got our Amazon store. If you're looking for anything, like for example, we do a lot with Garmin. I've been fortunate enough to, if you go to the link in the store, you guys will get the best prices that we can possibly dig up for you. And the fact that the Amazon group reached out to us to start a store, I feel honored. It's there for you guys. Like I said, yes, we make a commission on it. I wish I could pass all that commission on to you guys, but that's not the way they have the store set up. Not a sales pitch. Our only desire is to educate you and then give you the right resources. If you do invest in yourself, we want to make sure it's the best resource and one that's going to work for you, not just based on some online propaganda. So we want to make this a community. And Dan, I want to personally thank you for carving out a time out of your family's time, because we're doing this
absolutely.
on a day that, and I know you're getting ready to head out the door here. So thank you personally. Thank you and Sabrina and the family. And thank all of our listeners for sticking with us. We greatly appreciate it. Our next show on the Performance Podcast will be about distinguishing the difference between Epstein-Barr, chronic fatigue, Addison's disease. We're going to break those down. We've been receiving a lot of questions, confusions on what they are and what they're not. That'll be our next Performance Podcast. And Dan, you and I will get our normal Coach Robb podcast out here soon, and we'll get that shared with everybody as quickly as we can. So on behalf of everybody here at CoachRobb.com, thank you so much. Dan, thank you. And we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Take care.